Hey guys, Argent here. So with the American and Canadian election, particularly the Canadian election coming up, I thought it might be cool to do put my political science degree to use and do a little discussion. What is a presidential system? What is a parliamentary system? And what is the difference between the three of them? Now, it's important to note that that's the same thing. There are generally speaking three branches of government. There is the legislative branch, which, if you're American, it's Congress. If you're in another country, it would be the Diet, the National Assembly, something like that. Basically, it's a body of elected officials who tend to come from districts or from the nation in general, depending on your electoral system, and they have the ability to vote on things. And if a majority or supermajority of whatever they vote on, um, it becomes law. So in most countries, they have a bill that's submitted. The bill is voted on, and if it passes Parliament, it becomes law. And that is the only function of the legislative branch, is that they make law. Um, they choose what becomes law, and they tend to control funding as well. Now, the executive is very different. The second branch of most governments is the executive branch. The executive is, in ancient Roman times, there was something called imperium. And if you had imperium, you got to carry a fash. That's the axe with the bundle of reeds around it. Now, a fash and imperium basically means you have authority. I believe imperium literally means the authority to command. So an executive has control over the government. Um, they control everything. Like the president of the United States is the head of the military. He's the head of the civil service, etc. Um, it's kind of hard to define. It's basically because we're so used to kind of speaking of it in democratic terms, but basically Congress makes laws and the president runs the country, or the executive runs the country. It depends on what kind of system you're under. Um, Parliamentary systems work very differently, but I'm just trying to explain the different government systems, and the American one's the easiest to use as an example because the branches are separate. So the president can command, so the executive branch, sorry, can command the army, can command the civil service to do things. They can write sign-in statements. They basically have the ability to actually do things. Parliament doesn't control the civil service. Parliament doesn't control the army. Parliament can pass a law declaring war. They can pass a law stating the army can't do something or the army has to do something. They can defund and fund things, but they can't just command it. Like, the Speaker of the House can't just order the troops to do something or can't order the civil service to do something. They have certain powers, like they can call people to testify before Parliament, and they have the ability to impeach people, which is a bit like in old Roman times they used to be able to vote to declare people an enemy of the Republic and strip them of all public office. So they can do things like that, but that's passing a law. That's not taking an executive action. Um, then you have the judicial branch, which isn't really important to this to this whole discussion. But the judicial branch is, and I think all systems separate. The judicial branch, generally speaking, has to be separate because it prosecutes members of the other two branches who break the law, who do something illegal, and it decides what isn't in violation of established laws in the Constitution, because they don't, even in parliamentary systems, they don't trust the other two branches to police themselves. Um, there's some aspects of that, like Congress has the ability to impeach a president, but generally speaking, in most countries, the judiciary is technically the strongest branch because it can override the other two, which is a frequent issue in America because the Supreme Court can override the other two branches of government, like on same-sex marriage. A lot of the states had passed bans on it, but the Supreme Court was able to overrule them. And this leads to a lot of conflict because in a democracy, the will of the people is considered supreme, and the Supreme Court can simply override any popular decision or any executive order. So a lot of people really don't like that. So those are the kind of the different forms of government. The different branches of government. The judicial, the executive, and the parliamentary, and they'll make more sense when we go into this a bit more. So let's just go through presidential first because we've talked about it. Now, a presidential system is the most common form of government on Earth. It's in particular the most common form of government for new countries because it's the simplest and because it's more rationally based. It's based on general principles. It's based on an attempt to construct an optimal form of government. It's not really based on tradition or convention. The presidential republic was constructed by the founding fathers of America and has been copied by pretty much every modern republic. Some, in particular, countries that used to be part of the British Empire have different systems, parliamentary systems. But generally speaking, most countries adopt a presidential or semi-presidential system, and we'll go into detail about that in a minute. So in a presidential system, a president is popularly elected. Now, it depends on the electoral system. Some countries have a majority of the states, like, elect a president. Some have just whoever gets the most votes, like a plurality system. France is a system where whoever, the top two candidates face each other in a runoff. In America, it's whoever gets the most electoral votes, which is based on getting a majority of the votes in states that make up a majority of America's population, as kind of a way of trying to rebalance, to giving minor states more say and make every state count. It depends on the country. Some countries, like I said, like in Turkey, I believe they have a system very similar to America. It's called the spoil system, or winner take all, where the state, where if whoever wins the plurality of votes in a state, all the electoral votes of that state go to the president. So there's a lot of different forms of electoral system, but basically the president is to some degree popularly elected, and he holds executive power. Now, how much executive power it depends on country to country, but particularly in countries with weak parliaments or weak congresses, the president can holds near dictatorial powers. All executive power is in his possession, so he controls the army, the police force, the civil service, etc. And while Congress can sometimes restrain him, if Congress is of the same party as him, or the democratic institutions of a country aren't particularly well established, the president is a de facto dictator. So kind of some examples of this is in Colombia and Peru, they had extremely strong presidents, Fujimori and Uribe, not in that order, who used the presidential authority to essentially use emergency powers and basically turn the countries into short-term military dictatorships to deal with communist insurgencies. In the event of war in America, the president gets a whole bunch of additional powers, generally speaking. If you've seen the Star Wars prequels, they give emergency powers to the Chancellor. Generally speaking, during war and national crises, Congress will just give the president a blank check so he doesn't have to seek funding for every individual thing like he normally would, and lets him act in an extra legal way, which is kind of where the whole debate about Guantanamo comes from, because it goes against American law to some extent, but the president has an oath to protect America and to use his executive authority to protect America. So which one comes first? It's kind of hard to say. So some presidential systems will have a Congress and a Senate, or a Congress and something else. Most of them have one or the other, though. All of them have a National Assembly or a House of Representatives. Some will also have a Senate or some other form of upper house. Many of them only have one. Okay. So we have those. Then we have semi-presidential republics. And this is kind of a bit complicated because this is a transitional form of government. A semi-presidential republic, let's see here, a semi-presidential form of, let me just look at this. Semi-presidential is where you have both a president and a prime minister. In a full presidential republic, you do not have a prime minister, you merely have a president. And you will have a speaker or a head of the assembly or something, but they only have legislative powers. So it's very confusing because how it works exactly isn't entirely clear. A prime minister is, generally speaking, someone who wields both executive and legislative powers. So we'll go over to we'll go over to a comparison system here. Okay. So in the Canadian system, which is fairly typical for most parliamentary republics, what happens is voters will elect a legislature, and the leader of the largest political party. Now, keep in mind, in a legislative system, the leader of every political party holds a seat. So Stephen Harper's is like Calgary West or Calgary Center or something like that, but he has a seat that he is elected to, but he is also the head of the Conservative Party. So he holds these two positions concurrently. So last election, his party won a majority of the seats. So once the election's over, they go to the head of state, and he asks to form a government. Now, who the head of state is depends on the country. In most countries, it's the president. In Commonwealth countries, it tends to be the governor general, or in monarchies, it's the queen. And basically, they state, here's what happened. We've won the most seats, or we've won a plurality of seats. We want to form the government. So people go, okay, that makes sense. You can form the government. Now, these countries will, so they pick the prime minister. So the prime minister sits in Parliament, which is, to American listeners, kind of like Congress. Same thing, really. So they sit in Congress, and they sit on the floor. They watch the proceedings. They control their party from there. They get to vote on issues, etc. They also, though, have full executive powers. They get to control the bureaucracy. They get to control the army. They can just order them to do things. They also have the ability to appoint cabinet ministers. Now, appointed cabinet ministers always hold their own seats. So let me think of how to describe this. So imagine the cabinet postings in America, like the Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of the Interior, etc., were held by members of Congress. Members of Congress would hold those positions in addition to their seats. There's no separation of powers. In a presidential system, the president will appoint members of parliament, members of his cabinet, which will serve as the leaders of different ministries, as different parts of the civil service, bureaucracy, or just will control different parts of government with his indirect or direct oversight. In a parliamentary system, the prime minister gets to pick them from the MPs his party elects. And they will get to sit in Parliament, but also run their parts of government. Generally speaking, in parliamentary systems, the civil service is a bit more autonomous, because oftentimes the cabinet ministers are busy in Parliament, and they don't have as much time as a dedicated secretary and as much direct control. Also, they aren't career civil servants, so they don't really understand how things work as much. So generally speaking, in a parliamentary system, the the vice minister, is a civil servant, and they tend to have direct power over the ministry. Generally speaking, the cabinet minister will set general policy and theoretically has control, but a deputy minister will exercise a lot more control because they're representative of the bureaucracy. Okay, so let's try and put this into context for American listeners. So imagine in your country you only have one election, which is for Congress. Let's just say there's only Congress and the Republicans win. So then a representative from the Republican Party gains all the powers of a speaker, the president, and the majority leader. So they gain all those powers invested into one person. So they can command the army, they can command the civil service, they can appoint cabinet ministers, plus they are the chief legislator. So in essence, in a parliamentary country, all the power is concentrated into one person. And it depends on the country. In Canada, we have an extremely strong party system. You aren't allowed to vote against your party, or you're removed from your party and sometimes from your seat in general. You don't have what you have in America, where members of parties will break ranks and vote against things. There's no room for individual ideology. So basically, the prime minister controls their party with an iron fist, and they all vote the same way. Plus, they also control the bureaucracy and have executive power. So they have all executive power, all legislative power, and if they form a majority government, the opposition essentially has no power, and members of their party have no power. So the prime minister can basically do whatever they want. And they aren't directly elected like a president. So they only have to maintain the confidence of their local region. So it makes for it's a very strong party system, but it also makes for very unideological and schizophrenic decisions by parties, because it depends entirely on the personality of the leader and how they want to run things. And Canada has a long history of being dominated by people with strong personalities, because they possess pretty much dictatorial powers when they're in government. And the only check or balance against them is the Supreme Court, which is not particularly useful or powerful in Canada. On top of that, in Canada, we have a Senate, which is appointed by the Prime Minister. And they have similar power, a little less power, but they have similar powers to the American Senate, but they serve for life. And they are appointed by the Prime Minister. So the longer a party is in power, the more they can entrench their legislators in the upper chamber, if you will, and basically control things. So I said I was going to talk about a semi-presidential system. So a semi-presidential system is kind of a mixture of the two. It is a country where there is a president, but also a prime minister. So that will depend on how this works, depends on the country. In a lot of countries, the president is the head of state, meaning he represents the country. He often will handle foreign policy, any kind of affair of state. Like if there's a funeral or something, he will go to it. If there's like a summit or something, he'll go to that maybe. If babies need to be kissed and ships need to be dedicated, they'll go to that. And they hold theoretically some sort of ultimate authority. Like if the prime minister were to fall from power, they would be in charge. They're the one who ultimately would appoint the prime minister, etc. Semi-presidential systems, there is a president and there is a prime minister. And how they're defined is extremely vague. In Russia, for instance, is a semi-presidential system, and either the president or the prime minister can have executive power depending on which office Putin has, because he will move from one to the other when his term limits are up. In France, it varies. Charles de Gaulle had near dictatorial powers when he was prime minister, whereas Francois Hollande has much less. It really depends on how closely the two work together, etc. Generally speaking, though, in most countries that have a presidential system, sorry, a semi-presidential system. The president will control foreign policy, and the prime minister will control domestic policy. Some countries will have a presidential system, but it'll be such a weak presidential system that the president is elected by parliament or by Congress. They will vote a president to power. Um, so there's a couple countries like that, most notably South Africa, etc. Some countries they will elect the president from the House, and they will give up their seat to serve as president. But generally speaking, it really depends on the country. I find, generally speaking, dictatorships tend to be presidential republics. If we just look at the world, most dictatorial countries tend to be presidential republics, because it favors a strong centralization of power in the person of the executive. Parliamentary systems don't tend towards dictatorship, surprisingly enough, despite the immense concentration of power, because the prime minister is very vulnerable, because he has a seat, and so he can be voted out of power very easily. And he has to maintain the confidence of his party and maintain the confidence of the House. In parliamentary systems, if a government bill fails to pass, then there has to be an election called. So, like, if Obama's budget had have failed in Canada, there would have been an election, because the prime minister would have lost confidence of the House. Also, because the cabinet and party can revolt at any time and remove the prime minister from power, they're a lot more accountable, and government turnover happens a lot more often. So Obama can't be removed from power short of being voted out, or impeachment, which is basically impossible to happen, but for a number of reasons. But in a parliamentary system, at any point in time, Stephen Harper can be removed from power. And once again, it depends a lot on how savvy the person is, how much dirt they have on members of their party, and what the country's like. But generally speaking, yeah, that's just kind of how it works. I hope that made sense. I hope that kind of explained the difference between the two types of countries. I don't particularly have a preference between them. I think I tend to prefer presidential republics a bit more, just because I like a strong executive branch. Um, and I kind of like how a president is basically an elected king, because I like that. I like the dignity, theoretically, that the office has in the American system. But anyways, thanks for listening, guys. This is Argent Templar signing out.